We have 3 panel members. Each one will talk for maybe 5-10 minutes or something like that. Okay with you?
Well, they told us 12 minutes.
12, all right, 12
I'll
minutes.
talk fast.
Okay, no, don't talk fast. Talk slow, because we can't understand you when you talk fast.
And we said we would go in order of.
So we'll have 3 statements, and then we'll just have a conversation. So first of all, there's Charles Kolstad at the end.
That's me.
That's you.
That's me.
His research interests are in information, uncertainty, and regulation. That's perfect for this subject. His applied work focuses on climate change and energy markets. He's a convening lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that's the big deal. He's an advisor to the California Air Resources Board, editor of Review of Environmental Economics and Policy. He's authored many publications, including a text, Environmental Economics. He's a university fellow at the Resources for the Future and research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Larry Goulder, middleman, here at Stanford, professor of economics here at Stanford, senior fellow at SIEPR, national research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, university fellow of the Resources for the Future. I don't know how these people do all these things. His research examines the environmental and economic impacts of U.S. and international environmental policies, including policies to deal with climate change and pollution, and also explores policy to deal with climate change and pollution, explores the sustainability of consumption patterns in various countries. He chaired a committee to advise the California Environmental Protection Agency on the design of a cap-and-trade system to help meet the state's targets. So I guess what's getting underway now is your work.
Let's influence, let's say.
And Robert Weisenmiller was appointed to the California Energy Commission in January 2010 and subsequently made its chairman. He fulfills, this is an interesting board because each member represents a professional skill: physical science, environmental protection, economics, law, and he's the engineer. So that's kind of an interesting complexion of a commission. And now the chairman. So these 3 are our panelists, and each is going to talk for 10, 12 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. So, Charles, would you start?
Actually, George, I think we colluded before and thought it would work best if Bob started, then followed by me, then Charlie. That's okay with you.
Why did you want to do that?
We thought that it would be a more logical progression based on what we're going to focus on. But I hesitate to challenge a former Secretary of State.
Listen, it's me more important that I'm a former director of the budget. I'll sequester you. Okay, we'll do it you, right. Please proceed.
Thank you. As indicated, I'm the chair of the California Energy Commission. Just very briefly, the Energy Commission was signed, the legislation was signed in '74 by then Governor Reagan, and then implemented by then Governor Brown. And the opportunity to serve in the first Brown administration as staffer at the Energy Commission. I'm now the chair. I'm the scientist. Yesterday I proved that by welcoming it, pointing out to everyone that it was 3/14, so it was Pi Day. So anyway, on that note, let's talk about what the Energy Commission does. It sites thermal power plants. It does planning for the state. It does research and development. It does building standards for energy efficiency, for renewables. It checks what's really eligible for renewables, and we also do contingency planning. So one of the things we've done research on is climate change. And I think the basic message for people is that it's real, it's happening, and it's affecting things now. Just a couple of examples of why I say it's real, and we can talk about sort of the implications for the future. But at Scripps, there's a pier where they've measured the temperature every day since 1915. And they've seen that temperature go up by 2 degrees. They've also measured what's in the water there. They've seen changes there. You know, if you were there in the 50s, you'd see abalone. Now you don't. It was overfished, but the water's too warm. Similarly, if you look at California's weather records, since the 1890s, our temperature is now 1.7 degrees warmer. Another example is fires. At one point, every 10 years, we would have a horrible fire. If you look at the worst 20 fires, 10 of them have been in the last decade. And so the basic message is that it's real, it's changing, and when you look at the science of what we anticipate to happen in the next 10, 20, 50 years, it's very substantial on what it's going to do to California. So looking at what's the solution to that, basically California passed the landmark AB 32 legislation in 2006, which basically through a series of direct regulation and other programs, the basic goal is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And the ARB has been taking the lead on this. I point to an update on the standards that they have. Basically, as we all know, in 2008, our economy went down, our energy use went down, and so there's been a revision on exactly what the targets are, but we have a plan in place under the Air Board to achieve, basically to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. We get back to the 1990 levels. When you look at the parts of that, I'm going to talk primarily about the energy parts. Certainly transportation is a big piece. And again, I will talk about that more in questions. But if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, if you look at transportation, 50% of our energy use is transportation, 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions is transportation, and about 96% of that is petroleum. And much of that, about half of that is imported into the state from foreign sources. So in terms of security issues, there's a real question there. Basic goals on that, obviously the fleet standards are very important. The low carbon fuel standards, which are challenged. And the third leg of the Air Board's stool there is land use planning. But basically one of the things that we've started now is cap and trade. And we've had our first two auctions. Want to point out the significance of that. It's putting a price on carbon in California. We've had, frankly, the first one was a little shaky in terms of people getting experience on it. There was and things came out pretty much at the floor. The second, more recent auction, prices went from $10 to $13. So again, more significant. I'm sure I'll have more conversations about it. But this is something that's very important, and it's very important in California to do it right. One of the other elements, particularly on the energy side, we're emphasizing renewables and energy efficiency. And in terms of renewables, we've had a landmark legislation to get 33% of our power from renewables, as defined by California statute. We're well on the way to do that. We're more or less at 20% now. We have the target of getting to 33 by 2020. It looks like at this point I would actually anticipate we'll beat that target. And my reasons for saying that are, if you assume like a 40% contract failure rate, we will still get to 33%. I think basically the performance is turning out better than that. We're tracking the projects, seeing them coming online. That leaves me comfortable to say we're going to shoot past 33%. I think also it's a percentage of sales. So as we get more and more distributed gen and energy efficiency, that we're going to see reductions in load. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if we're not on a trajectory to get to 40% by 2020. Energy efficiency, California has always been very progressive on energy efficiency. From in 1978, the Energy Commission established the first round of building standards and also put in place appliance standards. Those building standards have led to, you can see measurable effects on California's consumption, and every 3 years we have updated the building standards. We have standards going in place this year which will reduce energy use in new construction by 25%. That's relative to the standards we had in 2009. One of our targets is to get to zero net energy houses, residential by 2020, commercial by 2030. We're also looking at, obviously, huge opportunity will be existing buildings. Most buildings in California were built before our first standards, and frankly, many of those are split many of those are renter occupied, and so that's again a split incentive question. And one of the things we've been struggling with for 30 years is how to really retrofit rented housing. We need to find ways to do it cheaply and to get deep retrofits to meet our greenhouse gas standards. Another part of the Air Board's AB 32 plan is combined heat and power, basically using the waste heat that in industrial processes produce electricity and waste heat, have the waste heat used in the industrial processes. In California, we have many examples of that, certainly in Kern County for enhanced oil recovery. There's thousands of megawatts. Most of our refineries, many of our public buildings, for example, this campus has a CHP project. So again, anywhere where you have a steady thermal load, you can produce electricity and steam and use the waste heat for heating, and that again gets you much more efficient. But I think the issue I really wanted to flag too, having said we're on our way to 2020, what's next? And one of the goals that Governor Schwarzenegger put in place was a 2050 goal. It was an executive order basically to get to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Governor Brown ratified that goal recently in his executive order for zero emissions vehicles. That's going to take an incredible sea change for California. In terms of, we need innovation, we need R&D, and it's going to be a stretch. We're going to have to, there have been a number of scientific studies trying to figure out how we could do it. A common theme among those studies is we're going to have to electrify the transportation system. Or get to zero emission transportation, everything, cars, trucks, basically, and that can be either by zero emissions, it could be electricity, it could be hydrogen, potentially perhaps even biofuels. But again, it's looking at the scale of the transportation sector, look at the challenges. We just need a phenomenal amount of R&D. We have to reduce our energy demand, again, zero net energy for new houses, but the existing buildings, we have to figure out a way to really reduce their consumption. And we probably have to look, again, a post-combustion world. So looking at electrifying many things which we now do with fossil fuels now, or using solar thermal, or again, I think we can get there, but it's going to be very, very challenging. And we're going to need phenomenal amounts of innovation and R&D to do it. So.
Thanks, George. Well, Bob indicated both the accomplishments in California as well as the state's challenges. And I would add that to that list of challenges, another one is the problem of emissions leakage, where the reductions in California in order to meet the goals of AB 32 might be met with increases elsewhere. An example is to the extent that California introduces costly policies that aren't matched by neighboring states or other states in the U.S., it could lead to migration of firms outside of the state, so that even though the state's emissions go down as a result, there's offsetting increases elsewhere on a nationwide basis. You're not getting any overall reductions. Now, the problem of leakage, these kinds of problems can be much reduced if climate policy is introduced on a national basis, indeed on a global basis. We're not there yet, but a lot rests on how California does, because I think to the extent that California's efforts are successful, it will help catalyze efforts elsewhere. At least it will push in that direction. On the other hand, to the extent that California's efforts are seen as a failure, it could set things back indefinitely. Now, as George indicated, I've done a lot of work related to California's climate policy, but actually I want to move toward, I want to focus my talk on the national level efforts. And as the handout that I'll be focusing on pretty closely indicates, I'll talk about some of the rationales for a federal level carbon tax. More on that in a second. George is referring to the fact that I've been pushing for cap and trade, and we have cap and trade in California. But now I'm going to talk about a carbon tax, but I will explain the method behind my madness in a minute. I'll also talk about the potential impacts of a carbon tax, and I'll try to put on my political science hat and talk, at least hazard some guesses about the prospects in the future. But I might want to start by mentioning that President Obama probably surprised a number of people by the intensity and length of his comments about climate change, both in his inaugural address and in the State of the Union message. In the State of the Union address in particular, he, I think, devoted about 8 sentences to the issue, which is fairly a lot, actually, saying the scientific evidence that humans are contributing, the climate is changing and that humans are contributing to it is strong. And he urged Congress to act. And then he said, quote, "But if Congress won't act soon, I will, with executive actions." So I'm going to return to that in a bit, talking about what might happen at the federal level, whether it's through the legislature or through executive branch. I also want to start by mentioning that at this point, a carbon tax is not just an academic idea. It's been implemented in at least 10 countries, as the graph on or the chart on the bottom of the first page of the handout indicates, including several of the Scandinavian countries, in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Iceland. China is now planning to introduce a carbon tax. 2 Canadian provinces have also introduced them. So it's being tested as we speak. I want to start by talking about some attractions from an economics point of view of a carbon tax. The first is it's cost effective. It's a form of emissions pricing. And as a result, it ends up being relatively cost effective compared with alternative conventional regulation. The reason is a carbon tax establishes a single price of emissions for all emitters covered by that face the tax. That means that a cost minimizing facility or firm is going to want to reduce emissions up to the point where the additional abatement or additional emissions reduction cost just equals the avoided tax. And since they're all facing the same price, they all reduce emissions up to that point. So the marginal costs of emissions reduction are the same across all facilities. So it's not the case that you've got some low-hanging fruit, that is, you've got some facilities that could have reduced emissions more at very low cost, and others are reducing emissions at a very, very high cost. Instead, it gets equalized. At the margin, everyone's facing the same cost, and that's a condition for minimizing the aggregate or economy-wide cost of reducing emissions. And that, I think, is not just a theoretical proposition. There are a number of studies out there that suggest that emissions pricing, whether in the form of cap and trade or a carbon tax, can reduce the costs relative to conventional regulation by anywhere between 25 and 50%. So it's a very attractive form of regulation. A second issue is revenue. The carbon tax would bring in revenues that could be used in one of 3 ways. One is it could be used in the way that George Shultz has been emphasizing. You'd use it in a revenue neutral way. That is, you'd use it to finance equal revenue cuts in existing taxes, or use it to give direct rebates to consumers. To give you an idea of the revenues involved, a $20 per ton carbon tax would yield approximately $1.2 trillion over 10 years, the Congressional Budget Office estimates. That would be enough, for example, to finance a cut in the statutory rate of the corporate tax from 35% down to 25%. So it's a fairly significant amount of revenue that's involved, as the graph indicates on the next page of my handout. Another thing you could do with the revenue is you could cut the deficit, which implies future generations wouldn't have to pay as much in terms of their taxes. A third thing you could do is use it to finance new government spending, either on infrastructure or on environmental projects or on just about anything. That's, for some, seen as a great thing. Environmentally oriented, environmental groups see this as a great way of financing green projects. Others think of this as a problem, that the revenue won't be used in a revenue neutral fashion. It'll be used to finance increases in spending, and it will just expand the appetite of the government and lead to larger government waste. I leave it to you to decide whether it's a blemish or an attraction. A third attraction of a carbon tax, and here relative to cap and trade, I might add, is that it reduces uncertainty about the price of emissions. Under cap and trade, It's the market that determines the price of allowances, which is the price of emissions. And as we've seen in Europe and in Southern California and elsewhere, those prices can fluctuate a lot. And many business people think that that's a problem. It really makes it difficult to make investments in new ventures. In contrast, under a carbon tax, the price is determined. It's set by the government as the carbon tax rate. And thus, that is one advantage of a carbon tax over cap and trade. Now, I promised George that I'd indicate why I'm sounding so positive about a carbon tax now when previously I was pushing cap and trade. First thing I say is I would be delighted with either form of emissions pricing, whether it's cap and trade or a carbon tax. The second thing is that I have to acknowledge that I did push cap and trade in California, and I'm very glad that we have it here. And I think what was the dominant reason that I favored cap and trade was political. I thought that, first of all, it existed elsewhere, it had been tried, and it was easier to link up a new cap and trade system with existing ones elsewhere. I thought it had more of a chance of getting through politically. For better or worse, the political support seems to have shifted away from from cap and trade toward carbon taxes. And so I think it makes it something that it makes sense to focus on, particularly at the federal level. But again, I'd be very happy with either. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, a carbon tax is not your ordinary tax. Not all taxes are created equal. This morning we heard about the distortionary effects of various taxes in the tax system, but as Glenn Hubbard mentioned, carbon tax is something different. It's a corrective tax. It doesn't cause a distortion. It actually corrects for market failure by putting a price on an externality or the damages to climate that ordinarily wouldn't command a price. So economic analysis indicates that so long as the tax rate isn't too large, the value of the benefits in terms of avoided damage to the climate will exceed the economic sacrifices, losses of profit, losses of real income, higher consumer good prices, as long as the tax isn't too large. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty about how big the tax should be. The next slide, or the next graph on the handout, provides some information on that. There was an interagency task force that suggested that the optimal tax rate should start out at around $20 a ton. But there's a lot of uncertainty about that. As long as the tax isn't too large relative to the externality, there are going to be net benefits. Well, let me turn. One question we might ask is, do we actually need the tax? Do we need further emissions reductions? The U.S. officially committed in Copenhagen to achieve by 2020 a 17% in reduction in emissions relative to 2005. Well, actually, several studies have suggested that we're already slotted to get about 10.5 percentage points of those 17, partly because of the low prices of natural gas, which has caused substitution to natural gas, which is less carbon emitting. Second, because of many state-level policies that are in place, such as that in California. Third, that the EPA is now vigorously pursuing a number of policies other than a federal carbon tax, and it's slotted to do other things, but for example, just briefly, it's going to tighten up the fuel economy standards, which will lead to further reductions. And the economic downturn itself also led to reductions in output that caused some of the, at least short-term reductions in emissions. So we're already close, we're already 10.5 percentage points of those 17 percentage point reduction. It's estimated that a modest carbon tax of perhaps only $10 a ton would get you the rest of the way. One thing I would emphasize, though, is irrespective of whether we're at the 17 percentage point reduction or not, economic analysis says it still pays to have the carbon tax. Because it's what adding the carbon tax gets you further net benefits because it gets the price right for carbon. Well, the last thing I want to mention is, here I'm going to put on my political scientist hat. What are the prospects? Well, I think the prospects, based on, I think the opinion of many folks that are closely connected with climate policy, politicians and analysts and others, the prospects in this current Congress are almost nil. They're very, very, very low. And it actually made me think this morning when we saw several economists talking about tax policy saying carbon tax would be a good idea. Lots of economists are in favor, economists of a conservative bent and more liberal bent. So policy wonks and economists tend to favor it, but there's a huge divide between what they favor and what is going on in political circles by the politicians themselves. I think the prospects are remote. The good news is, however, that there's actually a significant amount happening at the federal level by the U.S. EPA under the auspices of the Clean Air Act. And more is on the way. Unfortunately, the EPA's tools, such as various emissions caps that could be applied selectively to different sectors with no trading, are likely to be much less cost effective than a carbon tax or cap and trade for that matter. And another piece of concern is that the EPA is currently facing and will likely continue to face legal challenges as to its authority. On the good side, however, I think there is growing support at the grassroots level for a national level climate legislation. My colleague, John Krosnick, who's in the Political Science and Communications Department, has done a lot of survey work to show that citizen support for vigorous federal legislation has been growing. The challenge is to make the federal legislators' actions match the citizens' concerns. And perhaps one of the reasons it doesn't match is that, for better or worse, climate change policy is not a decisive issue among voters. It's usually ranked well below things like gun control or abortion or the economy as a whole. So I'll end with one prediction, which is, despite this, say, sobering news that the chances for legislation now are pretty low, and that that the EPA's tools that they are using are really somewhat cumbersome and not likely to be so cost effective. I do think that the U.S. is going to move at some point toward more aggressive climate legislation, which may in fact include a price on carbon. We will see, but my sense is, as the scientific evidence and actually the actual impacts of climate change continue, I think that ultimately the grassroots support will translate into legislative action.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on one thing that Larry was ending on, which is the likelihood that any action is going to take place at the national level on climate, on carbon tax or anything even resembling something like that. So what I'm going to do, though, is different from what many climate speakers do, which many climate speakers talk about the urgency of acting now, and that we need something because of the damages that are being wrought by the carbon emissions. I want to ask, why would a climate skeptic support a carbon tax? Because I think if you can answer that question, you can perhaps see a path through the political minefield, which consists of climate skeptics. These are people that doubt the severity of climate change or doubt that it even exists. And then you've got, of course, the climate non-skeptics who take the opposite perspective. So I want to address that question here. There are two possible answers. One is you can view carbon as a pollutant, but maybe disagree about how serious the problem is. But if that's the case, you can analogize it with driving to San Francisco with a 1% chance of getting in a fatal car accident and a 99% chance of having a nice dinner, and that small likelihood that it's a real problem can have significant effect on your behavior. Most of us would go down to California Avenue for dinner instead, if those are the probabilities we're facing. Another, or a tougher challenge is, suppose you don't think that the carbon is damaging at all. Suppose you're a pure climate skeptic. I'd like to argue that there are reasons why you might sign on to a carbon tax. And I admit that I'm not a political scientist, so some of the things I say maybe reflect that inexperience and the of economists trying to venture into political territory. But let's view the politics simply. Let's consider there's reds and there's blues. I don't mean those as Republicans and Democrats, although very roughly that's what it is, but there are Republicans that are in favor of doing something about climate. After all, most of the legislation that was introduced early on, McCain's bill, repeatedly introduced, came from the Republican side. And then there are Democrats that represent, for instance, West Virginia, that want nothing to do with climate change as well. So, but for simplicity, let's call it red and blue. Red wants to go slow, blue wants the opposite. So the question is, what opportunities are there for bipartisan actions? And I have a quote from Mitt Romney. Anybody remember Mitt Romney? That I think actually is pretty reasonable. And now he did say this before he was running for president, but the quote is, I believe, this is I being Mitt Romney, I believe that climate change is occurring, but I do not support radical feel-good policies which would have little effect on the climate, but which could cripple economic growth. Now, to me, that says there's a window for a pretty big window for doing a lot of things, but a lot of other things would be off the table. So I think the main reason why a carbon tax might go forward is that there is a suite of carbon-related policies that are now on the policy table. Larry mentioned some of them. I'll go through several of these, but the status quo favors the blues on some of these policies and the reds on others. So both sides have some bargaining chips here. One is the approval of the Keystone XL pipeline. This is the pipeline from the Alberta oil sands down to the Gulf. The Reds want to approve this to increase oil supply and reduce imports. The Blues don't like the high carbon footprint of the oil sands. Now, I just remind you, the oil coming out of the oil sands when it's in the pipeline is perfectly fine oil, not necessarily any different than stuff we use all the time. It's the fact that you have to burn natural gas up in Alberta to get the stuff out of the ground, which creates a higher carbon footprint. And the reason that there's opposition is that people would prefer to leave that in the ground for the sake of the climate. But that's an issue where the Blues have the upper hand, because it's up to President Obama to approve or disapprove that pipeline. We've heard about the pursuit of greenhouse gas regulations by the EPA under the Clean Air Act. And clearly this is a bargaining chip. The Reds want less inefficient regulation, maybe less regulations, but less inefficient regulations. The Clean Air Act is a blunt instrument to use on carbon, probably a pretty good instrument to use on some local air pollutants, but on carbon it's a little bit tougher. Blues want strong regulations, particularly on coal-burning electric. So there are two things that favor one political entity or another. A third one is fracking, which is intimately tied into this because that's the reason we're getting a lot of cheaper oil and gas. The Blues are concerned about the environmental impact of fracking and the effect of low gas prices on renewables. The Reds don't want to impede development of low-cost oil and gas for a variety of reasons. And the fourth thing I'll mention is exports of natural gas. Because of our price of gas has gone down a lot of these terminals that were built to bring gas into the U.S. are being proposed to be run in reverse, basically, to export gas from the U.S. Now, the Reds want to ease the gut of gas, helping allies and helping gas producers. The Blues should be of two minds. They fear the increased price of gas for some of their constituencies, but more gas in the world means lower greenhouse gas emissions globally. Now, there are some other issues that are less easily characterized as red and blue. There's the ethanol subsidies, also sometimes called low-carbon fuel standards, although it's not quite the same thing. They correspond closely. And these are basically agricultural subsidies disguised as climate programs. That's probably an oversimplification of them, but there's a lot of truth to that. And I think the reds and blues are mixed depending really on what their constituency is. If you're a red from Iowa, you think it's a great thing. Fiscal issues and taxing carbon, Larry went into that quite a bit. I don't really need to go into that any further, but it's very important. Innovation opportunities, a lot of people are betting on innovation to solve a lot of the carbon problems, but the fact is innovators want a return, and if there's no price on carbon, the return for coming up with a new technology that saves carbon is going to be a lot lower. So if you want to incentivize innovation, a carbon tax will provide that signal, which could be good for a lot of political constituencies. And then the final point is that there are varying regulations on carbon by state. We've heard about California quite a bit, but there are other states that have carbon regulations. And a lot of industry in the U.S., one of the reasons the U.S. works so well in many ways is that we have uniform standards that apply to manufacturers. And a lot of, whenever states take different approaches to the same problem, it can create problems for manufacturers. There would be a lot of people would favor the elimination of a patchwork in favor of something uniform. So just hypothetically consider a proposal. We institute a modest carbon tax, ramping it up over time. So, for instance, $15 a ton of CO2, rising up by $1 a ton a year in real dollars. Just to put some meat on that, $15 a ton is about the same as 15 cents per gallon of gasoline, which is, I think, the price of gas in the last 2 weeks here has dropped by more than that. It raises about $75 billion a year. That's not accounting for any response to the price. And just coincidentally, the 2013 sequester is $85 billion. So, we're talking about similar amounts of money. The revenue could be used, of course, for anything, but the obvious political way to use it is to use some of it to reduce the corporate income tax, which both blues and reds view as an inefficient tax, and some of it can also be used to reduce the payroll tax, which would address some of the regressive nature of a carbon tax. Don't have to have piles of money being shifted to different states to buy off constituency. Just reduce the payroll tax, which is a regressive tax to start with. You could approve the Keystone XL pipeline. With a carbon tax in the U.S., that sort of takes care of some of the problems associated with bringing the oil sands into the U.S. You can institute clear rules on fracking so that it can proceed in an environmentally sound manner. Ambiguity never does anybody any good. You could phase out EPA regulations of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. This was part of the Waxman-Markey bill that failed. And I would just point out that if this is the wrong balance to pass Congress, if the median congressional person thinks differently, then you can adjust these things to achieve a majority. So the point here is that carbon taxation is an opportunity to solve several problems, not environmental problems. Climate can be viewed as a side benefit, and the size of that side benefit depends on your perspective on how serious the problem is. But the merits really go beyond that, simply addressing climate change. So I guess I hope I've answered the question of can a climate skeptic still favor a carbon tax. I think yes. And I think, believe it or not, that hewing to Romney's admonition can be good for both the reds and blues. I think this is an issue that can muster a bipartisan majority. Maybe I'm just naive. Thank you.
Let me step briefly into the role of panel member and give you two experiences I've had while in office and a proposal. In 1973, I was Secretary of the Treasury when the Arab oil boycott took place. There was no energy department, so we inherited the problem. And I could see, first of all, we're dealing with energy as a strategic commodity. It affects our defense. And I think that's only been underlined as we've gone along, as we see the importance of how costly it is, but we also see how the lack of ability to have power where you use it is a major military problem. And I suspect with all of the emphasis on cyber attacks and so on, our grid on reliability is going to mean, from a civilian standpoint, we'll want to have more energy located somewhere near where we use it. Also, obviously, it had very disruptive on our economy, so we struggled with that. And I do remember in those days, people came in with ideas about alternative energies and so on, and I thought they had nothing substantial except they looked like pretty good ideas, and I hoped they would keep working. And then I saw, as soon as the price went down, all interest in that stopped. So we're on a roller coaster. That's happened several times. The second experience I had was in the mid-'80s when lots of scientists thought that the ozone layer was depleting. There were many who doubted it. In other words, they were doubters. They all agreed that if it happened, the consequences would be very bad. And so President Reagan decided we should take out an insurance policy. And that resulted in something called the Montreal Protocol. And it was interesting, when something definite was there, the creative juices of the American scientific and entrepreneurial kicked in, and somehow or other the DuPont company came out with something we could get people to agree to do. And it worked. It turned out that the scientists who were worried were right, and that the Montreal Protocol insurance policy kicked in just in time. So what do I get from this situation? I think the climate is warming. The evidence is just overwhelming. There's a new ocean being created in the Arctic. And it's interesting, if you look at a chart of the disappearance of sea ice, it goes on very gradually. And then all of a sudden, about 10 years ago, it's almost like a gulp, it disappears. So I think some of the discontinuities like that you have to worry about, because things may happen faster than you think. Anyway, I'm convinced that there is something going on here that's very important, and that we should take out an insurance policy. What would it be? I think one of the most important ones is support for energy R&D. And I've been involved with both the Stanford and MIT efforts, and I can see that people are getting somewhere. This is working, and prospects are right there. So that's practically no money in terms of the federal budget as money goes, and it attracts private money. In both the Stanford and MIT case, substantial corporate support joins the governmental support, and my suspicion is if the government lost interest, so would a lot of the private money. So I think keeping that going is important. I think a carbon tax would be a good thing, and I'm interested in the, but my idea, having talked with Grover Norquist about this, there is something called the tax mafia. And I would rather see it go forward as something designed to level the playing field, and that's it. So I would prefer a revenue-neutral carbon tax. And I think the chances of getting something like that enacted, there's no fiscal drag, and you're not funding government programs of one kind or another. You're just doing this for the sake of the emissions thing, and it seems to me you could sell it on that basis. And I'd like to see it very visible. Like, for instance, let the IRS administer it, and let there be a fund that's transparent. Don't include it in the unified budget so it doesn't get spent. And then maybe once a year, you make a distribution and just send it to every taxpayer and everybody on the earned income tax credit. So you'd have a very wide distribution, and the check should have labeled on it your energy dividend, your carbon dividend. So people get to, so they like a carbon dividend. That might help sell it. So that's my program. But anyway, let's just open up. First of all, do you have any comments you want to make on what each other said?
I have a comment on what you said. Two things. I think, first of all, the Montreal Protocol case is a little bit easier for three reasons. One is that the effects were already observed, very visible, more so than perhaps climate change and climate damages are today. Second was that we were fortunate there were low-cost substitutes to the chlorofluorocarbons that were doing a lot of the damages, so it made it easier to do something. And the third is that the benefits from avoiding further deterioration of the ozone were distributed pretty widely globally, pretty evenly, whereas with climate change, some countries, particularly those areas in the northern, nearer the poles, might actually become more temperate and actually benefit from it. So there's serious differences in the gains and losses. I'm not saying we can't learn from the Montreal Protocol.
All I'm advocating is the insurance policy concept,
Right.
which
The
was
other-
kind of like your example on driving to San Francisco.
Right.
The only other thing I'd say is I'd be delighted if the revenue neutral policy that you suggest were introduced. I think that there is some economic sacrifice involved in using the revenue, returning it in a lump sum fashion as a rebate to households, rather than using it to finance cuts in marginal tax rates. That can make a significant difference. If you can funnel the revenues to cut pre-existing tax rates rather than give it as a rebate, as a lump sum, you can lower the cost significantly. But I think that that economic sacrifice is probably one worth bearing for the political advantages.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that as well, that it's giving it lump sum seems like you're not using the political potential of that, returning that revenue as much as possible. Some people feel passionately about reducing the corporate tax rate or the payroll tax rate. So it seems like one could buy some support by using the revenue to return it in a different way, but that's my...
No, I'm afraid that if you start doing that, it'll get massaged around and
Well,
you'll
that's
get
possible.
lost.
That's possible.
And so that's why I want a method that makes it clear that you actually are revenue neutral. Yes.
Larry concluded by saying it was a low voter priority and a remote possibility, but you sort of opened by saying you thought something the executive branch might do. What the president might do? What things might he do from executive order?
Well, in a way, I think he's going to just intensify what's already happening. You know, contrary to perception, there's a lot going on under the EPA already a lot that's been committed in the form of tighter fuel economy standards. Also, there's at least 5 or 6 executive orders relating to sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, particulates, and cooling water that are in the works. And I think my thought is that the president will try to intensify that. I don't know how far he'll be able to go. It's interesting to me that this executive action by the EPA has gone as far as it has, almost without more resistance by some opposed to climate policy. I don't know how far Obama will be able to go. So perhaps consistent with what I said, that we won't get much in legislative, I'd also say that I'm not sure that there will be that much of an augmentation on the executive branch by executive action beyond what's already committed. Still, I do think that over the longer term we're going to see more, and it's perhaps because we will have failed to avert very significant climate damages over the next decade or two. Perhaps.
Yes, over there.
Larry, what kind of, how did the other countries decide the tax rate on the price setting for the carbon tax? So what kind of lesson or success story we can learn from?
I don't know as much of the details as I should, but I think in some cases these were seen more as revenue sources. They were introduced more on as a key revenue source than for environmental reasons. Tom, I see you nodding your head.
Well,
You wanna add?
British Columbia and Australia have been the two principal examples of a revenue-neutral carbon tax. I don't know a lot about these other countries.
Well, I think the motivation in the British Columbia case was clearly climate. But in fact, it was done along the lines that George would very much support. It was done in a revenue-neutral fashion with pretty much a fixed rebate across the board to households. And I think the success of their effort is encouraging.
Well, the great advantage is the ability to take the position with the Republicans in Congress that it's not really a tax. If it's revenue neutral, it's not a tax. Something that is perceived as a new source of revenue by Republicans for liberal agenda, whatever that means, has no chance of flying. But something that is really revenue neutral, seems to me, at least from some discussions we've had with Republican legislators, at least has a chance.
I think Grover Norquist initially said that it was not a violation of his pledge to put in a carbon tax. I think he changed his mind, but
Then all his funders came down and he changed his mind. But he's persuadable. Yes.
You mentioned natural gas prices having fallen. What's the impact if prices were to go up again on your argument?
I can't give you a quantitative answer. I just know that it's thought that a significant portion of the already observed approximately 10.5 percentage point move toward the goal of 17 percentage point reduction from 2005. A significant component of that was the drop in natural gas prices, which led to substitution away from coal, which is much more carbon emitting, toward.
Once it's achieved.
Yeah. So, but I guess your question is it reversible?
Yes.
Maybe Koichiro, you can answer that, but my assumption is that this is reversible, that if indeed natural gas prices went back up, there would be some reversion. Does that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Another reason to support the rebate as opposed to reduction in taxes, I think, is that if this is a successful policy, then over time, the amount of carbon that will be taxed will be reduced. And if you've given an equal tax cut in some fashion, it won't over time be revenue neutral, and it'll just be increasing the issue that we already have of where are we going to get the money to pay for government services that everybody wants.
I think that's true, but you could make the policy more flexible so that the size of the tax cut could be adjusted through time to match the amount of revenue.
That's tough.
It is tough.
Yeah.
But on the end,
I would like to just shift the focus for a moment, if people will tolerate it, from carbon pricing to thinking about other trace gases, which are higher greenhouse gas equivalents. So one question is, in regard to California, if you take the estimate, which is now pretty well documented, that about half of the increase in temperature from pre-industrial levels is attributable to anthropogenic releases of methane and fluorocarbons earlier. Now it's hydrofluorocarbons are main refrigerant. So there's a question as to whether, from both a political viewpoint and from a viewpoint of buying time for innovation, you don't get a stronger impact by mitigating methane releases and working on having a replacement for the refrigerants which replace the fluorocarbons, both of which are much more potent, and because of their equally, because the wind blows these around, it's a global externality, but you have different immediate impact on warming, and therefore on rising temperature of ocean, greater violence of storms, storm surges, flooding, and drought. And you could delay that, postpone that, and have a short-term impact. There are a number of other things you could do for short-term, but since we talked about gas, I just wonder whether we might add to the set of options which would be saleable in terms of this is not climate change, this is weather change. Okay? And if the American public is become more concerned about these manifestations of the long-term change, the question is what you can do to slow it and stabilize the violent, severe weather-related damage.
Well,
Yeah, certainly, we talk a lot about greenhouse gases, but you say methane is more like 30 times the effect. Certainly there are other emitters. A lot of interest now looking at black carbon, soot, what that's doing. And so, again, certainly a broader suite of policies, and there were certainly some interesting things in terms of the black soot is obviously, I was going to say, more likely to be coming from underdeveloped countries, and certainly influencing some of the things like the snow cap in the Himalayas. So again, you might get a broader policy agreement, across countries, if you've got the broader suite.
Yeah.
I think that your own work suggests this. What you indicate makes a lot of sense. Putting aside administrative costs or issues of monitoring, I think for black carbon and soot, California is already doing a lot in terms of diesel regulations, and that's in the spirit of what you're suggesting. For methane, isn't there more of a problem of monitoring that might make it prohibitive? I guess I take.
Well, I think
let's keep it going around.
That's an interesting issue, but a lot of it is quite concentrated in certain industries which are responsible for high amount of that methane output.
Okay. Jim?
Yeah, I'd like to turn the attention a little bit to R&D that may make a difference in carbon dioxide and some of the other environmental stuff. And I want to do this more to Bob, because you're directing a program within California Energy Commission, EPIC program, that should have some effect. Could you comment, do you think, whether that's going to actually have any significance in technology and climate change, or is this going to be just more around the edges? And
we try to look for where the impacts can be from.
Maybe you should tell people what EPIC is.
Oh, sure. Yes, since about 1997, the Energy Commission has had an R&D program, originally the Public Interest Energy Research Program, funded by a surcharge on electricity and also natural gas. And that's been used to fund R&D. We went for a legislative extension of that. It came up for reauthorization. Didn't succeed. It was considered a tax. And once it was considered a tax, we couldn't get 2/3. In response to that, the governor asked the PUC to maintain the level of the surcharge and to come up with a program collected by the surcharge. PUC would set up the authority for it. Energy Commission would administer it. And now that's proceeding is very close to at the PUC to a PUC decision. I'm hoping in May. I would note we are being sued by Southern California Edison on this question of whether or not it's a tax, a fee, complicated issues there. As Jim knows, one of the questions for the scale of program we have, there's always a lot of indications to try to do a lot of things with it. And we've really tried to focus on what I'll characterize as the loading order, which means, first of all, energy efficiency, renewables, and to really match the state's policies. We've had a very strong climate program, and one of the things we're looking at is not just mitigation but adaptation, readiness. And so certainly we can point to a number of successes, and going forward, we've had a very public program with the PUC for people to make suggestions on this, and so we can continue to go forward. By that, I mean, if you look in California, there are some resources that are relatively unique to the state, or some problems that are relatively unique. We're sort of leading the nation in renewables, which means renewable integration issues are hitting us first. We're leading, if you look at geothermal, it's certainly a much more significant resource in California than is nationwide. If you look at biomass, again, given our ag dependence, there's a lot of potential for biomass. And frankly, with climate change, again, we're having a lot of problems in our forests with changes there resulting in, like the fires we're having. So we're trying to figure out ways to use that more successfully. So we've tried to tailor that to California's needs, realizing there's a much broader program at the Department of Energy, also trying to work with them to leverage it. But again, a lot of very successful R&D activities in energy efficiency. Certainly we've put a lot of money there and can point to a lot of success there. Similarly, things like synchrophasers. Again, that's something where we really have, it's like doing an MRI to the utility grid. And so it's very important for stability as you put more renewables or intermittent resources on. So we've done a lot of things there. But also transportation. Again, if you think about transportation in terms of our air quality issues in Southern California, something like 18% of the economy there is goods movement. And at the same time, the air issues in the South Coast, San Joaquin, are staggering. So we have to figure out a way to really get innovation in our transportation system there to deal with the air issues at the same time to maintain the economic viability there.
Yes. No.
It's pretty widely known that if we do a perfect job of eliminating these problems in the U.S., that the world is still going to have a big problem because of China and all the other emerging markets that still pollute heavily. How do we draw them into helping to constructively participate in these programs as well?
I would note one of the things that the governor is doing in that issue is we're going to China in April on a trade mission, and as part of that we're looking at putting in place MOUs where basically to encourage Chinese officials to come to California to get boots on the ground experience with our cap and trade program, similarly with some of our energy efficiency programs and some of our R&D. So, as I said, we're going in April. Certainly, I'm trying to make sure there's a very strong energy component of that, climate change component, and just as we're picking sites and encouraging Californians to be part of the trade, part of the swoop.
Is a California-focused approach going to be good enough? Shouldn't it be a U.S.-wide approach?
U.S.-wide would be, certainly there is programs on the federal side, although as you know there's been some issues in Congress in terms of the relationship between what Holdren has done in China.
The national level is somewhat easier in the sense that states are not supposed to have foreign policies. But the simple way is a countervailing tariff. I mean, that sounds like my economics is coming out here. But a countervailing tariff on countries that are sending carbon-intensive goods into the U.S. And that was part of the Waxman-Markey bill, a controversial part of it, that if a country had a regulatory policy in place that was similar to the U.S., then it would be exempt from that. But if it didn't, then the president could institute a countervailing tariff, which would also provide an incentive for that other country to do something. That other country usually is China, but they call it the other country.
Yes, in the back.
I'd like to take a slightly off topic, but to you, Doctor, about the Monterey Shale and the implications there, even for innovation and fracking, if that goes, is going to fly. Could you give me a state of the
Sure. First of all, just for folks in general, in California, if you look in the Kern County area, there is a lot of very heavy crude. It's in terms of its viscosity, it's you can more or less shovel it in the way, And so for a long time, we've been producing that with steam injection, hot water injection, actually some of it with CO2, some potential with CO2 injection, and certainly chemicals. So in a way, in California, there's been something, I would say, very similar to fracking going on in those deposits. Now, at the same time, there are lower quality resources, this Monterey Shale, where there's been a lot of interest in that. I think there's been a Wall Street Journal article, a New York Times article, there's the UCS study that was just done. Most experts tend to think that it's primarily oil, although certainly I think Paul McAvoy is going to say, talking about the economic benefits from gas. But like I said, when I talk to the geologists, they tend to think it's more oil than gas. The formations are pretty twisting. Anyway, there's a bunch of reasons why people, you can line up geologists and get different stories on how much potential there is there. Although, again, there seems to be, for example, I think there's some leases that are going, which at this point, if one understands the federal government is not expecting much in terms of revenue because of the difficulties. Part of the question is California's regulatory scheme, and that's done by the Department of Oil and Gas. And it's been a pretty controversial area, and they have proposed draft regulations. At this point, they have just been sued by the Sierra Club and Center for Biological Diversity for those being too lax. And at the same time, certainly if you talk to WISPA, the oil industry, there's a lot of interest in moving that. There's certainly large estimates for what the economic benefits for California could be of that, particularly in an area, Central Valley, but where there's been a lot of economic distress. So it's going to be ground zero. I think what the governor has said is that he's expecting the legislature and his energy officials to deal with the question. And so certainly talking to Mary Nichols, we're talking about trying to get a better handle on, this would have a lot of environmental consequences, and at the same time have economic development. And we all know that in California, we do put a premium on our environment. So the question of what that trade-off will be, but I think it's very important from our perspective that the fracking be done in a way that doesn't have some of the issues we've seen in the rest of the country. I mean, frankly, when you see the ads, it's always the aquifers are much higher than where they're drilling. On the other hand, certainly some of the science, good Scientific American article on it, a lot of these are in areas where there's just been a lot of holes punched in the ground for drilling. And so the question of, even if you've done a pretty good job on that, the sort of potential leakage, and actually there's been observed leakage from the pattern of existing wells that were perhaps not well capped. But it's going to be a huge policy issue. It's already emerging as one, I think, in the legislature this year.
Thank you. Secretary Shultz, I actually have a question for you, and it involves foreign assistance around this challenge. It seems as we get deeper into the science and into the various, I think, very wise proposed solutions that we're hearing about today, it's hard, it all ties together into this global web of this challenge. We had a Senate resolution some years ago around the Kyoto Protocol. Basically, it was almost unanimous, saying that we should not implement the Kyoto Protocol in the United States unless developing countries also came on board. And yet, rule of law in those countries, and the large countries in particular, and I've spent 30 years working in China, do not have the on-the-ground capacity to implement the kinds of monitoring and verification that we take to really regulate or even implement a carbon tax on the ground. To what extent can the United States play a role in rule of law and environmental rule of law development in the developing world where the politics are?
In the case of the Kyoto Protocol, the Senate voted unanimously, 95 to nothing, to the negotiators not to sign it and bring it back. But they did it anyway. It was, in my opinion, completely irresponsible. on the part of, if you're negotiating on behalf of the country, you're presumably negotiating and reflecting what the desires are. You're not just out there doing whatever you think. So that was a very bad piece of work, I believe. But if you take the Montreal Protocol example, and going back to the question about China, the United States led the science, we led the diplomacy, and as something to do was developed, we could start with the large countries and get people on board and then spread it out, and that's the way you get something accomplished. And I think in China right now, I don't know if you've been to Beijing lately, but it's really awful. You don't want to go out of your hotel room, it's so bad. And they are desperate to come to grips with it. They understand it's a huge problem. So I think that there's a very persuadable situation. Maybe we have one last question. We've run out of our time. I didn't mean to intimidate people. All right.
So I have a question to Charlie and Larry, and I completely understand and I agree with you that revenue neutral cap and trade or environmental carbon tax is going to be good for the national level, but in reality, still the negative impact of those policy will be disproportional to states and also disproportional to industries. So there's always winners and losers. If you look at, for example, California versus Ohio, Iowa, California is really clean state, so I think we are not gonna be hurt that much. But basically, even if we can say this is great policy for the national level, there's gonna be a lot of discussion between those winners and losers. So if you have any thoughts to deal with it.
Well, you can define the winners and losers in lots of ways. You can define them as by income, low income, high income. That was the reason for suggesting a cut in the payroll tax to address that disparity. But if you do it, if you're talking about winners and losers regionally, that's a little more difficult to deal with. Ohio and California are great examples. Ohio would be negatively affected. The other side of that coin is Ohio's had really cheap electricity compared to California because it relies on coal. So, you know, is it fair or not fair to impose somewhat higher costs on Ohio than California? Maybe fairness has nothing to do with it. It's really a political calculation. I think one of the problems with Waxman-Markey is we all know there was like a 2,000-page law that tried to pay off different regions, different industries in a very complex way. I think there's a lot of interest in not getting too complicated with a proposal like this, but I'll leave that to the politicians.
I'm glad you asked the question. One of the attractions as well as perhaps problems with cap and trade was that it did allow one to try to undo disproportional impacts across different industries or across different firms through the free allocation of allowances. As some work of my own and others has indicated, by taking just a small share of the allowances and giving them out free to particular firms or particular industries, you can prevent a profit loss in those energy intensive or highly trade exposed sectors. That's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in that it might seem like it adds to fairness, avoids some of the disproportional costs. On the other hand, as Charlie indicates, it leads to 2,000 pages of extra legalese, and it can lead to a lot of infighting. One thing I would mention that's not much appreciated is that you could actually do the same thing under a carbon tax. It's perfectly analogous to free allocation of allowances under cap and trade. Instead of free allocation of allowances, what you offer to particular sectors or particular firms is exemptions from the carbon tax for some amount of emissions before the tax kicks in. and that has exactly the same effect. It can help avoid profit losses. But again, it's a two-edged.
Marginal incentive.
That's right, inframarginal. So at the
Yeah.
margin, you have the same incentive to reduce just as much, but your profits aren't hit as much. Again, it's a two-edged sword, though. It, on fairness grounds, it may seem good. On political grounds, it may look good in some ways because it'll help bring on board some of the highly energy-intensive sectors. But then it can also lead to a very, very complicated form of legislation that some would oppose. So I think there, at least in principle, are ways to deal with the uneven costs that are imposed across firms. I don't see a simple way of dealing with the uneven costs across regions. That, I think, is harder.
Well, even with cap and trade in California, some of the issues we're dealing with is the municipal utilities, particularly the BP, are much more reliant on out-of-state coal than, say, PG&E or Edison. And at this point, looking at all of the municipal utilities, they are making efforts to get out of the out-of-state coal plants. They have different limitations there, particularly LAWP. And part of that is driven by the California cap and trade. The other part is the existing regulations. So for San Juan, EPA is really requiring all the owners to make major investments, and at this point, the California utilities are trying to exit as opposed to make those investments.
I was interested in listening to the people from British Columbia talk about how they put their revenue neutral carbon tax in. It was not done by an environmental agency. It was done by the finance ministry. And they were fierce. And people came in and they wanted exceptions. They said, no exception. You give one exception, you got to give another.
Right.
You got to be tough. And so they managed to pull it off.
Wow.
Well, one last thing. Let me tell you about a little experiment. A little over 5 years ago, I put solar panels on my house on the campus there. By this time, if I have a little chart, monthly electricity bill, before and after, by this time I have paid off the cost of my panels and also the opportunity cost of the use of the money. I also have an electric car. So I'm driving on sunshine, and it's free. All you people buying gasoline, well, you can complain about the price if you want. I'm driving for nothing. So there you are. Well, thank you very much.